Fifth Estate.
I never thought a hurricane could be that big. It was like 25 to 30 feet of water.
It is the most awesome natural force on Earth.
Oh God, please let it stop. It's gonna be in a house in a few minutes, Faye.
Enough raw energy to run every electrical appliance in North America for 5 years. The destructive power of an atom bomb.
It went boom, and the water just rushed the whole house.
Oh God, I can't believe this.
Until you see it, you really don't comprehend. It's unbelievable. You fly for miles and miles and miles, and all you see are the tops of the houses. Just the tops of the houses and the odd tree sticking up.
But the real lesson of Hurricane Katrina was not the devastation of New Orleans, or even the 1,800 people it killed. The true tragedy is that virtually no one did anything to prevent it.
I don't think anybody anticipated the breach of the levees.
Nonsense. And that's what I told the media.
And after the storm, when it seemed it couldn't possibly get worse, it did, especially for one family from Canada.
The door's open, and you can see her body lying in the doorway.
He killed a girl and shot the guy. They said the little baby was full of blood.
I don't think anyone would ever have suggested to Helen and Paul, you can't go back because one of you is going to be murdered.
Hello, I'm Bob McEwen. Welcome to the Fifth Estate and to New Orleans, where 3 years after Hurricane Katrina, this city is a shadow of what it once was. Before the storm of the century, about 500,000 people lived here. Today, fewer than half of them have come back. The neighborhoods that were hardest hit, like here in the lower 9th Ward, were mostly poor, black, and like the rest of the city, several feet below sea level. When the levees breached, the remaining residents here say the high water mark was between 25 and 30 feet, which means each and every one of these houses was far underwater. Tonight, we're going to tell you a story about the storm of the century that you haven't heard before. It's also the tale of two Canadians who came here because they wanted to make a difference, to help the disadvantaged and the poor. It's a story of love and murder that explains a great deal about what went wrong in New Orleans before, during, and since Hurricane Katrina. They called it the Big Easy, the city that care forgot. But part of New Orleans' charm has always been the threat of impending doom. With water on three sides, the city is protected by levees, built about 50 years ago.
The statistics are that every century we get 5 major storms that could flood New Orleans. The last one we had was 1965, which was Betsy. So we were living on borrowed time.
Ivor Van Heerden founded the Louisiana Hurricane Center. Ever since, he's been a meteorological Paul Revere, warning anyone who would listen that the levees were poised to fail.
I also realized that a lot of the levees were made of mud and in some places sand. Anybody who has any feeling for a hurricane recognizes when you got open bodies of water next to an earthen levee, you're going to develop a vicious wave field, and those waves are going to chew up the levees.
Government engineers kept insisting their flood barriers were good for a century or more. But it remained New Orleans' doomsday scenario, the killer storm that would cause the flood, that would overwhelm the levees and drown the city. It's 4,000 kilometers from the banks of the Mississippi to Dalhousie University in Halifax. where Edmonton-born Paul Galunas was just finishing up his medical degree. He couldn't know how doomsday in New Orleans would affect him. Paul's life was already a full one. He'd met Helen Hill when they were both at Harvard. They married. It was obvious they belonged together, even when Paul was studying in Canada, Helen in California, according to friend Lucas Pierce.
He and Helen had made an agreement to write a letter to each other every day. And for I think probably a year and a half between when I first met Paul and when Helen moved to Halifax, he followed through on that, where they sent postcards or letters or some sort of postal exchange every day.
Together again, back in Halifax. After Helen and medicine, Paul's passion was music, and the band he founded, called Piggy.
When I had the idea for this band, it was to recreate the spirit of 1920s and 30s calypso music, which often touched upon important social issues and also had a certain sense of humor to it. Break away from the crowd. They're all quiet, you be loud.
And it wasn't just a band called Piggy.
In fact, there's even a new member who's here tonight, who's just joined the band recently.
Oh my God, and this member we call...
This is Rosabella.
Rosie the pig became the family pet, the band mascot, and a political statement about the ethical treatment of animals, one of Paul's favorite causes.
There we go.
And Helen was every bit as committed to social justice and accomplished at her profession.
My name is Helen Hill, and I'm a filmmaker. I make mostly animated films. With my films, I use a lot of different animation techniques, from cutout puppets to 3D puppets to drawings.
She was soon making a name for herself as a remarkably creative animator and teacher.
The good news is that it can be easy to make a film. You don't need a lot of money or a film lab, not even a camera. And you certainly don't have to keep up with the latest technology.
Paul and Helen's apartment in Halifax's North End was a gathering place for a growing circle of friends. And when they weren't making music or film, Helen organized neighborhood projects, like Food Not Bombs, providing meals for the needy. But after 5 years in Canada, she and Paul were ready to make a move.
This is our very final farewell show. After this, it's kaput.
The hard truth is that Paul is going to New Orleans.
They'd spent a year in New Orleans after college. Now, in January 2001, they'd decided to say goodbye to Halifax and go back.
Get ready to dance. This song's called She's Stepping Out. It's a song of liberation. 1, 2, 3, 4. So desperately, this is herself, this is really it. She's gonna do herself and be free. We're just setting off on our trip.
Helen Hill, Paul Galunas, and Rosie the pig loved road trips and adventures. Now they were heading from Canada's Atlantic coast to the Gulf of Mexico. Destination, New Orleans, Louisiana. They had no idea yet what kind of adventure it would be.
Helen and Paul were not naive. Before Katrina, New Orleans had, if not the highest crime rate of a city in America. It was awful close, and I think that you took the good and the bad with New Orleans.
first, the New Orleans that Helen Hill and Paul Gelunas found on their return was the city they'd remembered, rich with romance and intrigue, which they described to friends back in Canada, like Lucas Pierce.
It was, the ultimate crossroads. It's the birthplace of jazz, and it's the great mixing and melting pot of so many cultures of the Americas.
But beyond the French Quarter and the tourist trade was the New Orleans rarely seen by visitors. Crime, poverty, deteriorating infrastructure like schools.
And I almost cried to see, to think about the kind of neglect that we've allowed to happen in our schools over the years. Many times we allow those situations that we cannot control to be excuses.
John Raphael is a former police officer turned pastor. He says many young people in New Orleans might as well be growing up in the third world.
Regardless of what life brings your way, you keep your trust in the Lord. Lean not to your own understanding. The teacher's main priority for the day was to make it through the day without somebody getting killed. It wasn't teaching, where students didn't have books, didn't have the things that, there was such a degrading thing for kids not to have toilet paper in a restroom.
But harsh surroundings didn't deter Dr. Paul Gelunas.
We all were going into medicine to help, but he really wanted to help people.
When Paul and Dr. Tara Parquet started an inner-city medical clinic called Little Doctors, it was healthcare Canadian style. No one was turned away because they couldn't pay.
Everyone called him Dr. Paul because it was hard to some patients, it was difficult to say his last name. So everybody, where's Dr. Paul? How's Dr. Paul's doing? So he was a caring physician who truly cared about the patients regardless of whether they had income or not.
Because of his philosophy, Paul's income as a doctor was modest. When he and Helen had enough money to buy a small house, they found one, painted yellow, in a mostly African-American inner-city neighborhood. It's where their little boy was born, Francis Pop, known as Poppy. Just as they'd done in Halifax, Paul and Helen soon attracted a colorfully bohemian crowd that included René Broussard.
They seem to have this bubble of positivity, that positive energy that sort of was with them everywhere. It's like it was infectious.
Among their social circle were musicians, writers, artists, and community activists, people who wanted to break down social and racial barriers in the city. Two of them were Sherry Branch and Brad Ott.
New Orleans has always had a severe gap between the rich and the poor, between black and white, and certainly over time this place has gotten a lot more economically and racially segregated.
And it got worse when the Civil Rights Act passed and whites fled New Orleans for the suburbs to escape integrated schools, leaving a legacy today of decrepit public housing and education, rampant unemployment, and poverty. Paul's friend, Heather Harkins.
When Paul began his practice in New Orleans, the overwhelming majority of his patients were black people who were experiencing racism on a daily basis. And in discussing their care and their treatment with them, he would hear about their lives and the conditions they were living in. And the way in which racism influenced those factors deeply upset him.
Paul Gelunas not only built his medical clinic here, he made house calls in some of the toughest parts of a dangerous city. Jake Hill says his sister and her husband were well aware of the issue of safety.
Helen and Paul were not naive. Before Katrina, New Orleans had, if not the highest crime rate of a city in America. It was awful close. And I think that you took the good and the bad with New Orleans.
And of course, everyone knew the urban legends about the threat of a killer storm.
There was one famous one that, if in fact a hurricane hit New Orleans directly, the levees could break, and didn't think that much of it. It seemed so far-fetched at the time that the entire city of New Orleans would be flooded.
But at the Louisiana Hurricane Center, Dr. Ivor Van Heerden knew differently. before Katrina, did you believe it was a realistic possibility that New Orleans as we know it would be totally destroyed?
Yeah, I firmly believe that.
Uninhabitable forever.
I firmly believe that.
The year that Helen Hill and Paul Galunas returned to New Orleans, Ivor Van Heerden began an exhaustive investigation of every conceivable scenario if a hurricane were to hit the city. Of crucial interest were the levees, built to be the last line of defense. The city of New Orleans is surrounded by water on 3 sides, held at bay by the levees constructed around the city by the Army Corps of Engineers. But Ivor Van Heerden's computer models estimated that the federal government had built those levees about 1.5 feet too short. He concluded a major hurricane could breach the levees, effectively drowning New Orleans under more than 10 feet of water, killing thousands. But no one in power, it seemed, was listening. Then, in the summer of 2004, Ivor Van Heerden convinced Louisiana emergency agencies to conduct a computer simulation of the worst case, a Force 5 hurricane that slams into land just west of New Orleans, where the levees are most vulnerable. They called it Hurricane Pan. The conclusions were startling. A storm surge that overwhelmed the levees and devastated the city.
The estimate was 65,000 died. The whole city floods. No levee breaches needed.
And how far before Katrina was that?
A year.
Ivor Van Heerden explained the alarming lessons of Hurricane Pan to the White House and to FEMA, the U.S. Federal Emergency Management Agency, pleading to have disaster plans drawn up. The response?
They did nothing. Nothing happens.
At the Little Yellow House in central New Orleans, Paul, Helen, and Poppy were familiar with the drill. Each hurricane season, friends back in Halifax heard about Louisiana's latest near miss.
Every year there had been a hurricane warning with an evacuation. And every year they'd packed up the car and driven out and stayed the night elsewhere and come back and everything had been fine.
But as we were all about to see, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, nothing in New Orleans would be fine again for a very long time.
I'm gonna die. The water is steady rising in the attic, ma'am. And I'm a drown in the attic.
Monday, August 29, 2005. In New Orleans, Louisiana, a date that will never be forgotten. Katrina was, as all hurricanes are, a brutal storm. Barreling towards New Orleans at force 5, the highest possible. But the worst was yet to come. Even when Katrina's driving winds and torrential rains finally stopped.
And then this young guy comes to me and he says, I've just had a phone call from a nursing home. And he said, the water's rising, half a foot an hour. What's going on? Now this is, 8:30 at night. The storm's long gone.
The hurricane was gone, but a vast quantity of water had been left behind by Katrina's massive storm surge. It began to pour over and through the levees. And the desperate calls started pouring in to 911.
There's a woman, her newborn baby is trapped in a house right across the street from the school, and she can't swim.
It's a terrifying record of what happened as the city of New Orleans and its people began to drown.
I'm gonna die. The water is steady rising in the attic, ma'am. And I'm gonna drown in the attic. Pray for me, huh? Oh, sir, I will pray. I'm gonna have to pray for everybody, even myself.
The biggest problem was that during the storm, so many people had remained in the city because they had no other choice. For years, Ivor Van Heerden tried to convince the local, state, and federal governments that even if an evacuation of New Orleans was ordered, there were 127,000 people in the city without access to an automobile and with no way to escape a deadly storm bearing down on them. But the official emergency plan was the same. In the event of a major hurricane, the people of New Orleans would be expected simply to drive out of the city on their own. But that didn't happen. Now, entire neighborhoods were inundated, but water was only part of it. The deadly mixture included toxic chemicals, human waste, corpses of animals and people.
Until you see it, you really don't comprehend. It's unbelievable. You fly for miles and miles and miles, and all you see are the tops of the houses. Just the tops of the houses and the odd tree sticking out.
Paul Gilunas and Helen Hill had driven to the safety of her hometown, Columbia, South Carolina, to ride out the storm. They expected to be back home in a few days. Then they saw the pictures of New Orleans. Their little yellow house, now an island in the poisonous lake that was once their neighborhood. But they were the lucky ones. Almost 2,000 people who'd stayed in New Orleans died. Tens of thousands, mostly African American, were left with nothing, not even help.
We didn't see serious helicopters till late Friday, early Saturday. People have been in the water 4 or 5 days. Just imagine, you're sitting in your home, you're forced into your attic, you have to knock a hole through your attic, you get out, somebody comes in a boat, they take you to an interstate. The interstate's an island. 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're sitting on a concrete bridge. No food, no water, with your kids. I'm surprised they didn't riot.
From Washington, on national TV, George Bush proclaimed the tragedy unavoidable.
I don't think anybody anticipated the breach of the levees.
When President Bush went on television to say no one knew that the levees could be breached, what was going through your mind?
Nonsense. And that's what I told the media. Absolute nonsense, because at the Hurricane Pam exercise, I had sat down virtually as I'm sitting with you and went over a 20-minute slideshow with somebody from the White House, and then gave that person a CD with not only our surge models, but a whole description of what could go wrong. So, yeah, they knew. The federal government knew.
The lack of emergency planning also crippled the New Orleans police. Hundreds of officers were trapped by the flood. Hundreds more abandoned their posts, leaving streets and businesses to the looting mob.
We got a lot of stuff. You want to buy, you can get it. Come on, buy. Come on, yeah.
This is not America. I mean, look at these old ladies, you know? This is ridiculous. Utterly ridiculous.
Though news cameras caught uniformed officers joining in, Deputy Police Chief Marlon DeFillo insists reports of criminal behavior by cops were overblown.
I can tell you that, you know, the 97% of this department acted in such a professional and admirable manner.
DeFillo says law and order began to return when the National Guard arrived and started shipping out the people stranded in New Orleans, many known to the police.
I would see an individual boarding the bus who I knew I arrested for a homicide before, or an armed robbery, or a rape, was getting on the bus heading to Dallas, Houston, Atlanta. And I'm saying, boy, I wish he stays there.
That's the good news.
I'm saying, boy, I hope he never comes back to New Orleans.
It was several weeks after Katrina that Paul and Helen returned to their house together. By then, it and almost everything inside, including many of her precious films and sketches, was beyond saving.
Their home had a ring around it, and everything beneath that ring was covered in brown sludge. Books had mushed into this oatmeal-like substance. There were frogs and fish living in their home behind the bookcases.
The question was there anything left in New Orleans to go back to? Paul was happy practicing medicine in South Carolina, and they all enjoyed being close to Helen's family. But soon, she was the one becoming homesick.
Helen talked about coming back all the time. She would constantly calling us and keeping up with our progress to find out what's happening in New Orleans. Can people come back? Are people back yet? And we all wanted them back so bad because the city just didn't seem right without them.
So Helen started a campaign to help Paul make up his mind.
He asked me if I would hand out these postcards, you know, asking people to write why they should move back, and they were already addressed and stamped, and you know, it's like a covert campaign. I put on mine because Paul was my doctor. I said to keep me alive.
Eventually, Paul couldn't say no. On the first anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, the family returned to New Orleans. But even a full year later, much of the city was a ghost town where almost nothing worked. And as the people with nowhere else to go came back, so did the crime.
It was not necessarily that the crime was spiraling out of control. It was more that New Orleans was still very much a raw community in recovery where there weren't necessarily adequate utilities or school systems. And that Paul was concerned about the health of Poppy and Helen and with the toxic sort of sludge around and just the whole host of things that happen after a hurricane.
Paul joined another medical clinic, and he and Helen settled back into New Orleans life, soon celebrating Poppy's second birthday, as she wrote to Melissa Andrews in Halifax.
We're happy to be back in this very crazy town. Little Francis Pop turns 2 on October 15th. He's very sweet, funny, and energetic little lad, and boy, do we love him.
But as everyone would soon find out, crazy was the least of New Orleans' problems in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina.
There's a man standing in the hall, and he's kind of crouched down with a gun.
I don't think anyone would ever have suggested to Helen and Paul, you can't go back because one of you is going to be murdered.
Tragically, that's exactly what would happen. But when it did happen, it would become a rallying cry for all of New Orleans.
Shame on you, Mayor Nagin, Superintendent Riley. You have really let us down.
It was early in the morning of January 6th, 2007. Paul Galunas and Helen Hill had been back in New Orleans for about 4 months, renting a small house on North Rampart Street in an inner-city neighborhood. A few doors away was a bed and breakfast catering to tourists. The only guests that night were a couple from Houston, Texas. At 5:30 a.m., they were awakened by someone knocking on their door. True Faust Finnen and her husband Will got up to open it and found themselves face to face with a stranger.
There's a man standing in the hall, and it's fully lit, so I can see him very clearly, and he's about this far away, and he's kind of crouched down with a gun.
She pushed the door closed. I lunged on the door. The guy, hit the door.
And we both just slammed it and it shut. You know, and you could hear it latch.
Just down the block, Paul, Helen, and their 2-year-old son, Poppy, were fast asleep.
I woke up because I heard Helen calling, "Leave us alone, don't hurt my baby, get out." And I thought, I thought maybe she was having a bad dream.
Paul Galunas couldn't know that just a few doors away, the police had arrived at the B&B. They were taking a description of the escaped gunman at the very moment that Paul realized he and Helen were in the midst of a nightmare that was terribly real.
I saw her at the front door, and a man was restraining her, and she was struggling in his grasp. And she saw I was there, and she screamed, "Yell!" She said, "Call 911." And then there was a gunshot.
Paul took refuge in the bathroom, shielding his little boy from the man with the gun.
And then I must have put my head down, and he shot. And then I just very, very slowly got up, and I felt while I was there, I felt that there was blood on the ground, and I didn't know exactly where it was from, if it was from Francis or me.
It was Paul who'd been shot 3 times in the face, arm, and hand. Emotionally shocked, losing blood, and carrying his son, he went looking for Helen.
I saw Helen was laying on the ground with a big pool of blood around her neck, and I saw that her stomach wasn't moving.
Down the street, True Faust Finnan was telling her story to the police when they heard the gunshots from the direction of Helen and Paul's house.
Then we all run out the door, out the front, and I hear this wailing cry. The door's open, and you can see her body lying in the doorway, and her, little bare feet and her little flannel pajamas, and her face down in the door. Then, after a few moments, Miss Houston comes running back, and she says, "I need somebody to hold the baby." And I said, "Well, I will." And she said, "Well, he's covered in blood."
Paul and his son were put in an ambulance together and transported to the hospital. Sherry Branch was among the friends who rushed there to meet them.
Paul was just lying on the bed, and his arm was all bandaged and bloody, and his clothes were bloody.
Yeah. What was his frame of mind?
For all the pain he must have been in, he was very lucid and very wide-eyed, and he wasn't panicking or crying. He just was saying that they told me Helen's died, and I don't believe it's true. Could you find out for me just to make sure?
Helen Hill was buried in Columbia, South Carolina, where she was born and raised. She was just 37. She and Paul had been married for 11 years.
I loved Helen so much. She was the sweetest person, and we just had such a good relationship. And both of us, were pacifists to the ultimate degree, and we just weren't prepared for anything like that. Her murder attracted unusual attention for one killing in New Orleans. Since Hurricane Katrina, this has been Murder City, USA, with twice as many homicides per capita as the runner-up Detroit. 40 times that of Toronto. But in a place where most murder victims are young African-American males in the drug business, the senseless attack on a couple who'd come to the city to help became a symbol of all that's wrong with New Orleans.
I remember a radio host told me, he was interviewing me on a radio broadcast, and he said, "Reverend, I have to apologize. I was one of those people who said as long as they're killing one another, just let them do it. It's not bothering me."
Inner City Minister John Raphael says the killing kept getting worse because no one dared to speak out.
I think many of the people who were involved in violent offenses believed that and knew that nobody's going to say too much about it. The people in the community are going to be afraid to say anything, and as far as people outside the community, they're not going to really respond too much.
From this point of view, you can clearly see thousands marching in protest. It's an obvious outcry. They want to see changes in this city, and soon.
Helen Hill's murder was the final straw. Just days later, 5,000 people took to the streets of New Orleans to vent their anger, blaming City Hall and the police.
And so today I want to say, shame on you, Mayor Nagin, Superintendent Riley, District Attorney Jordan. You have really let us down.
The death of Helen Hill wasn't only a symbol of the horrific New Orleans murder rate. It also attracted attention to the breakdown of the justice system after Hurricane Katrina and the record of the New Orleans Police Department. The year before she died, there were 161 murders here. Of those 161 murderers, only one was ever tried and found guilty, a conviction rate of just over half of 1%.
Katrina had brought the New Orleans Police Department to its knees. Hundreds of cops quit. Witnesses and suspects disappeared. The records room was a swamp. Case files and evidence water damaged or destroyed. 3,000 inmates had to be released for lack of evidence, perhaps including the future killer of Helen Hill.
It's easy to forget that before Katrina, New Orleans had, if not the highest, murder rate in the country, awful close to it. It went up 70% after Katrina, but it went up 70% from something that was already absurdly high.
Jake Hill, Helen's brother, arrived in New Orleans the day she died. After the hospital, his first stop was the police homicide division. 3 trailers in a parking lot. Inside, he says, were phones and computers that often didn't work.
And this was, again, 500 days after Katrina. This was not a month after Katrina.
But as the months passed, there was no suspect. Then Jake Hill discovered something almost unbelievable, that the police hadn't yet connected Helen's murder to the armed break-in at the nearby bed and breakfast just minutes before.
This was 3 doors down. It happened at the same time. I know New Orleans is a violent place, but it defies imagination that it was just so random that within 2 or 20 minutes of each other, there were 2 separate incidents involving guns and young African-American men.
He found that detectives working the murder case didn't have the description of the armed man at the B&B, and he learned that when radioed about Helen's shooting, the police forgot all about gathering evidence at the guest house. It wasn't until a year later that True Faust Finnan told Jake Hill the police had ignored clues left by the man with the gun.
I kept waiting for them to come and do the fingerprint thing, not even to do it, but at least to mark it off, because he came in through the kitchen window. There's the kitchen counter. He had to have put his whole palms on that counter to get in. Great fingerprints.
But the police never got them.
How much of it has to do with the damage wrought on the New Orleans Police Department by Hurricane Katrina, I think?
I can say this, is that as soon as I started working with them, and this was the day after Helen was killed, I was shocked at the obvious lack of resources that they had at their disposal.
The justice system, for whatever set of reasons, doesn't seem capable of coping with the volume of murders here. I mean, in 2006, before Helen Hill was killed, there were 161 murders, I think, in the previous year. 1 conviction.
Well, and I tell you that, and that's why I said Katrina exposed many of the weaknesses that the criminal justice system had at that time. We had a system that cases did lag through the system. People who want to participate in the system fear for their lives. And people said, well, why should I come forth if my life is in danger? Or I'm going to wait 3 or 4 years before a case goes to prosecution.
The investigation into the killing of Helen Hill is now almost 2 years old, officially a cold case. Today, the man in charge is Detective Urban Bush. With Paul's help, he's pieced together a scenario that explains how the murderer got from the bed and breakfast to inside Paul and Helen's house.
Helen was a very generous, but also a very intelligent and cautious person, and she definitely didn't let him in through the back door. which is how it turned out that he got in.
Fleeing the B&B, the gunman apparently leapt over 3 fences and reached their backyard just as Helen was letting Rosie the pig out for her nightly bathroom break.
They proceed to the first room in the residence, at which point Miss Hill apparently decided to confront her attacker.
So she fought back?
There's evidence that she struggled with her attacker.
What sort of evidence would you have concluded?
We have recovered DNA evidence from under Miss Hill's fingernails.
But because the New Orleans crime lab was destroyed by Katrina, it took 8 months to get the DNA results back. And though it may sound like a break, the reality is the vast majority of criminal defendants in the U.S. aren't in any DNA database. After Helen's murder, Paul and Francis Popp moved back to Canada, then to California, where he's now practicing medicine again. But he says his full-time job is his father to his son.
My little son Francis, he's just the sweetest, most wonderful boy in the world. And he really, really wants to know what happened and who killed Helen. And he asked me who the bad man was who killed his mama. And he says, he says once in a while, he says, I want to go to New Orleans to find the bad man who killed mama. And he worries about my safety, Francis does. And he worries about, you know, he's a very well-adjusted boy, but it's so important to him. And I just think we have to do everything we can.
If Ivor Van Heerden is right, the chain of events that led to Helen Hill's murder was part of the same problem that allowed Hurricane Katrina to do so much damage. Decades of neglect by the federal government.
And do you believe George W. Bush truly doesn't care about this city and the people who are here now or were here before?
I honestly don't believe he cares. If you listen to him very carefully, for a while he would refer to New Orleanians as those people in that part of the world. Those people in that part of the world, like we belong in Timbuktu or somewhere. And he said that at least 7 times in his major speeches. And to me, that says it all. The proof of the pudding is there's no pudding. There's no money. No real money.
$50,000 African Americans lost their homes to Hurricane Katrina. Almost 250,000 people have never returned to New Orleans after the storm. Only a fraction of the city's infrastructure has been rebuilt. So it seems inevitable that the new New Orleans will be smaller and whiter.
There's a new Orleans, baby. The chorus jumping, the music's thumping. Come out and play in New Orleans.
And if the images in the city's new tourist campaign are any guide, most of the Big Easy's problems will remain out of sight, out of mind.
I've always loved New Orleans, always. But if something like that could happen to people like Helen and Paul, of all people, part of me was like, I wonder if I should even stay here.
It's a question Paul Gilunas doesn't grapple with. 2 days after Helen died, he and his son left New Orleans. They haven't been back.
I love my friends there and I keep in touch with them, and I want them to be safe and I want the best for the people there, and I hope that, that things can get better for people there. It's very sad, and I don't want to be there at all.
A footnote to this story. True Faust Finnen, the bed and breakfast guest and the closest thing to a key witness in the Helen Hill case, died this past summer from cancer. With her passing, the only remaining lead to the killer's identity is that DNA evidence found under Helen's fingernails. We'll keep tracking this story and update you when there's news. Now, stick with us. We'll be right back. We'll be back in just a week with another original edition of The Fifth Estate. Now, for everyone here at the program, I'm Bob McEwen. Thank you for watching. We'll see you soon.